It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and gray, the kind that wrapped the world in a sleepy mist. Clara Dawson was rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes, the radio humming faintly in the background with a song her mother used to sing. Her home, a modest cottage with ivy hugging the stone walls, sat at the edge of a sleepy New Hampshire town where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. At exactly 9:17 a.m., a knock echoed through the house. Clara froze. Visitors weren't common, not this early. She dried her hands, wiped them against the hem of her cardigan, and walked to the door. Through the window pane, she saw an old man standing still, wearing a brown overcoat and holding something in his hand, a small object clutched tight like it meant the world. When she opened the door, he looked up slowly. "Are you Clara Dawson?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, the kind that had held back too many words for too many years. Clara hesitated. "Yes?" He extended his hand. "I believe this belongs to you, or rather, it did, once." In his palm was a worn leather wallet. Old, faded, the edges frayed and stitched by time. Clara blinked, confused, not reaching for it immediately. "I found it," he continued. Was 1970. Back it down. Her breath hitched. That was the year her father disappeared. Clara invited him in, more out of shock than hospitality. The man stepped inside, slow and cautious, as if the wooden floorboards might judge him. He took off his hat, revealing wisps of white hair, and clutched the wallet like it would fly away. They sat at the small kitchen table. Clara poured tea. Her hands trembled. He looked around the room with quiet familiarity. It was like he'd imagined this place 1,000 times. Perhaps he had. "My name is Walter Quinn," he said. "I used to be a truck driver. Long hauls mostly. Back in '73, I stopped for the night at a little roadside diner on Route 5. That's where I met your father." Clara's fingers wrapped around her cup, tightening. "You knew my dad." Walter looked down. "Not exactly. I didn't know who he was back then. We shared a booth. It was raining like the sky was grieving. He looked lost, like someone running from something he couldn't explain." He paused. "We didn't talk much. He left in a hurry and dropped this." He slid the wallet across the table. Clara stared at it. She hadn't seen that wallet since she was 5. She remembered it clearly. Her father used to keep a tiny photo inside, a picture of her, hugging her teddy bear. With trembling fingers, she opened it. There it was. The photo. A little girl with curly hair, smiling at the camera, oblivious to the storms life was preparing. She covered her mouth as tears spilled. Walter looked away. "I didn't know where to send it. There was no ID, no address, just that photo. I carried it with me for years. Every time I passed through a town, I'd ask, but no one knew." "Why didn't you just throw it away?" she asked softly. "Because it felt wrong, like throwing away a part of someone." He sipped the tea, his hand shook. "And maybe, deep down, I thought it would find its way home one day." Clara wiped her tears, still staring at the photo. Memories came flooding back. Her father's laugh, the way he carried her on his shoulders, the sound of the door closing that last morning. And then nothing, just silence, and a mother who cried behind closed doors. Walter reached into his coat again. "There's something else." He pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "This was tucked behind the photo. I didn't notice it until years later." Clara took it gently. Her name was written on the front, childish handwriting, familiar. She opened it. Inside was a note, barely a few lines. "To Clara, if you ever see this again, know that I loved you. I never stopped. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, Dad." She broke. Her sobs were soft but deep, years of unanswered questions unraveling. Walter sat in silence. the kind of silence that honored grief. They didn't speak for a while. The tea cooled. Outside, the clouds shifted. Light poured through the window, casting the wallet in a gentle glow. "Why now?" Clara finally asked. Walter sighed. "I'm old, and I've carried too many regrets. This one, it felt like it still had a chance to be set right." She nodded slowly. The photo, the letter, the wallet, each one a fragment, each one a whisper of a man lost to time. But maybe, just maybe, not forgotten. That evening, after Walter left, Clara placed the wallet on the mantel. Next to it, she placed a photo of her father, the only one they had. She looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "Welcome home." The sun had barely crested the horizon when Clara awoke the next morning. The events of the previous day clung to her like dew to grass, silent, persistent, and shimmering in her memory. She sat up slowly, letting the weight of the old wallet beside her bed remind her that yesterday wasn't a dream. The wallet, her father's, still weathered, still silent, but now heavy with meaning. She cradled it again, like she was holding a lost piece of herself. Downstairs, the house was still, save for the occasional groan of wooden beams adjusting to the morning chill. Clara made coffee, her fingers moving on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. She returned to the living room where the wallet sat on the mantel next to the lone photograph of her father, a black and white portrait taken the year before he vanished. In the photo, James Dawson looked young, proud, and full of life. Nothing in that image hinted at the man who would vanish without a trace. Clara sat down and opened the wallet once more. The photograph inside hadn't changed. A tiny girl with curly hair, arms wrapped around a teddy bear, with one ear slightly torn, smiled brightly at the camera. She remembered that day. It was a summer afternoon. Her father had taken her to the town fair. Cotton candy, balloons, the carousel. He had won her that bear at a ring toss booth and snapped the photo right after. She remembered his laugh, the warmth in his eyes, how he called her his brightest light. And then, months later, he was gone. No note, no goodbye, just silence. For decades, that photo was lost, and now here it was, untouched by time, tucked inside a wallet that had become a time capsule. Clara turned the photo over. There, written faintly in pencil, were the words, "Clara, 1973, never forget this smile." She held it close to her chest and closed her eyes. Later that morning, Clara sat at her desk with the wallet, the photo, and the letter. She had questions, so many questions. Why had her father been at that diner? Why was he running? Why didn't he come back? The letter he had written was so brief. "If you ever see this again, know that I loved you. I never stopped. I'm sorry I couldn't be there." It wasn't enough. Not for a child who had waited by the window every day for a father who never returned. Not for a daughter who had buried her anger so deep that even her tears had forgotten the path. She picked up the letter again. Her father's handwriting was shaky, uneven, almost as if he had written it under distress. Something wasn't right. She turned to her bookshelf, pulling down an old wooden box where she kept her mother's keepsakes. Among them was her father's journal, a slim, leather-bound notebook she had saved from the attic years ago but never opened. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open. The entries were sparse. January 5th, 1973. "Clara turned 5 today. I bought her a new dress. Her smile was worth everything." February 14th, 1973. "Emily says I seem distracted. I am. The headaches are getting worse. I haven't told her yet. I don't want to worry her." March 1st, 1973. "Saw the doctor again. The diagnosis is not good. I need time to process this." The pages stopped after March. Clara felt her throat tighten. Her father had been sick, and he hadn't told anyone. Not her, not her mother, not even in his final letter. She whispered into the quiet room, "Oh, Dad, why didn't you tell us?" Later that day, Clara called the only other person who might know more. Her Aunt Margaret, her father's younger sister, who lived 2 states away. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice picked up. "Clara, sweetheart, what a surprise. Everything all right?" Clara's voice wavered. "Aunt Maggie, do you have a moment? I need to talk about Dad." A long pause. "Of course, darling, I'm listening." Clara explained everything. The visit from Walter Quinn, the returned wallet, the photograph in the letter. Aunt Maggie didn't interrupt. When Clara finished, the line was silent for a few seconds more. "He told me," Maggie finally said, "back then, about his illness, but he made me promise not to tell anyone, not even your mother." Clara felt tears sting her eyes again. "Why did he leave, Aunt Maggie? Why not stay and fight it with us?" "He was scared, not of dying, of watching you and your mother suffer through it. He thought disappearing would spare you the pain. He thought he was protecting you." Clara shook her head. Even though Maggie couldn't see, it hurt more, not knowing, waiting. "I know, love." That evening, Clara sat by the fireplace, the photo in her lap, the letter in her hand. The anger that had simmered for decades began to soften. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had loved her enough to carry her smile in his wallet, loved her enough to write a letter, even if he never got to deliver it. She took a deep breath and whispered, "I forgive you." In that moment, something shifted, like the closing of a chapter she hadn't known she was still reading. The next morning, Clara made a decision. She would find out what happened after that diner, where her father went, how his story ended. Walter Quinn had opened the door to the past. Now Clara would walk through it. Clara had never traveled to Vermont alone before. The drive was long, winding through stretches of pine and sleepy towns with diners that hadn't changed since the 1970s. In the passenger seat sat the wallet. She had placed it in a small wooden box wrapped in a soft cloth, as if protecting a relic of someone sacred. It was more than a possession now. It was a question that still needed answering. James Dawson had vanished in 1973. Now, 50 years later, Clara was determined to follow his last known steps, and she would begin where Walter Quinn had seen him last. The diner on Route 5. The place was still there. Millie's Diner read the hand-painted sign swinging gently above the door. Time had done its best to fade the red paint, but the name endured. The scent of bacon and maple syrup greeted Clara as she stepped inside, accompanied by the quiet jingle of a bell over the door. Booths lined the window, sun spilling through dusty blinds. The place felt like a time capsule. A woman behind the counter looked up, her graying hair pulled into a bun. "Help you, honey?" Clara offered a polite smile. "Hi, I'm looking for someone who might have worked here in the 70s. I'm tracing some old family history." The woman laughed softly. "Well, you're looking at her. Been here since '68. I'm Millie." Clara's heart skipped. "Then maybe you can help me. My father was here in 1973. He disappeared soon after. His name was James Dawson. Do you remember him?" Millie's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful pause. She motioned toward a booth. "Sit down a moment." Clara obeyed, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her sleeve. Millie joined her, eyes narrowed in concentration. "Tall man? Brown hair? Looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders?" Clara nodded. "I remember him." Her breath caught. "You do?" "He came in on a rainy evening, ordered coffee, sat right over there, didn't touch his drink, just stared at the window like he was saying goodbye to something." Millie paused. "Another man joined him for a few minutes. They talked real low. Then your father got up, paid, and left. He left something behind, too. His wallet, I think." Clara felt her throat tighten. The other man was Walter Quinn. He found the wallet. He gave it back to me just last week. Millie blinked, surprised. 50 years later? Clara nodded. That's why I'm here. I want to know what happened to my father after he left. Millie leaned back. There was something odd. He dropped a receipt on the way out. I picked it up. It had an address in Montpelier on it. Didn't mean much to me back then, but maybe. She scribbled the memory down for Clara. A street name, a house number. Clara felt her heart beat faster. A lead. Montpelier was quieter than she remembered. The address led to a small, boarded-up house at the edge of town. The paint peeled, the mailbox rusted, but the number matched. Clara parked the car and stood at the gate. It was as if the house had been waiting. She pushed open the creaky gate and stepped up to the porch. The door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, then knocked softly. No answer. She called out, "Hello?" Still nothing. Clara pushed the door gently. It groaned as it opened, revealing a home frozen in time. Dust blanketed the furniture. Cobwebs hung in corners. The air smelled like memory. Old books, wood, and something faintly metallic. She stepped inside. On the mantel, a faded photo caught her eye. It was her father. Older, thinner, but definitely him. He was standing beside a younger man, arm over his shoulder. Clara picked up the photo, her fingers trembling. On the back, written in the same handwriting from the letter, "Tommy and me, home, finally, 1974. Who was Tommy? She searched the small house slowly. In the bedroom, she found an old cedar chest filled with letters, all addressed to T. Dawson. Dawson. The realization hit her like a wave. Tommy was her half-brother. One of the letters, dated 1982, was written by her father to Tommy. "Tommy, I hope one day you'll understand why I left the way I did. Your mother gave me a reason to keep fighting. I never stopped thinking about Clara. I carried her photo every day, but I couldn't bring the pain to her door. I hope someday she forgives me." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the letter in hand, heart thudding in disbelief. Her father hadn't abandoned them. He had started over, somewhere else, with someone else. And yet, he never forgot her. Later that evening, Clara sat on the porch of the abandoned house, watching the sunset over the hills. Her thoughts were tangled. She had a brother. Her father had lived a whole other life. But he had loved her, enough to write, enough to keep her photo. She looked out into the golden light, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt found. The next step was clear. She had to find Tommy Dawson. Clara couldn't sleep that night. Back at her hotel in Montpelier, she sat by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching headlights flicker past on the lonely street. The photo of her father and Tommy rested on the nightstand. Her mind refused to quiet. A brother, a whole other life. How do you grieve a father who had lived, loved, and died all over again without you? How do you reach across decades of silence? She stared at the name on one of the letters, Tommy Dawson. Her father had never let go of her memory, but he had never returned. Instead, he had poured his love into another child. Clara wasn't sure what hurt more, the abandonment or the thought that love continued, just not with her. But now she had a name, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance at understanding. The next morning, Clara stopped by the Montpelier Public Library. She approached the front desk, holding her breath as if the past might collapse if she spoke it aloud. "Hi, I'm looking for someone named Tommy Dawson. I think he used to live here. I'm not sure if he still does." The librarian, a woman in her 60s with glasses perched at the tip of her nose, smiled warmly. "Let me check the local directories." A few quiet minutes passed. Then the librarian pointed to a printed address on the screen. "There's a Thomas Dawson listed in East Calais. It's about 30 minutes northeast of here." Clara whispered, "Thank you," and wrote down the address. Her heart began to thump. It felt like a drum calling her to a moment she wasn't sure she was ready for. The road to East Calais was narrow, flanked by pines and open sky. The house was a modest white cottage with a red door, a wooden swing on the porch, and a stack of chopped wood beside the fence. Clara parked the car. She sat for a few moments, gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing the words in her head. "Hello, I think I'm your sister." "No, too direct." "My name is Clara. Our father was James Dawson." Still too abrupt. She sighed. There were no right words for this kind of meeting. She stepped out of the car. A boy's laughter floated from the backyard. Then a dog barked. She approached the front door slowly and knocked. Footsteps. The door opened. A man in his early 40s stood there, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that mirrored her father's. He blinked, surprised. "Can I help you?" Clara swallowed hard. I, I think you might be my brother." Silence. Tommy stared at her, stunned. Clara continued, her voice trembling. "My name is Clara Dawson. Our father, James, he left my mother and me in 1973. I just found out about you, about all of this." He stepped back instinctively, running a hand through his hair. "Wow, I wasn't expecting that. I mean, come in, please." She stepped inside. The house was cozy. Family photos lined the mantel. Tommy with his wife, two kids, and in the center, an older photo of James, aged but smiling. Her breath caught. He looked happy. "He told me about you," Tommy said softly. "When I was old enough, he said he had a daughter, someone he left behind." Clara sat down, her hands folded tightly. Why didn't he come back? Tommy exhaled. Because he didn't think he deserved to. He always believed he'd done something unforgivable. He carried that guilt for the rest of his life. Clara nodded slowly. He left us with nothing, not even an explanation. He wrote you letters, dozens, but he never sent them. I found them after he died. He kept them in a box under his bed. Clara's voice cracked. I only got one. It was in his wallet. Tommy disappeared into the hallway and returned with a small box. These are yours, he said. Inside were envelopes, aged and yellowed, all addressed to her. She lifted one and opened it. Dear Clara, I watched a little girl today at the park who reminded me of you. She had your same laugh. It hurt, and yet it healed me a little. I hope your mother is well. I hope you still dance to the radio. Another letter. I saw a daisy by the roadside. You used to pick them and braid them into your hair. I remember everything. Each letter was a thread connecting a father to a daughter he never stopped loving, and each one was a promise he never kept. They sat in silence. Then Tommy spoke. He died 2 years ago, heart failure. He passed away in this house, peacefully. He had your photo beside his bed, always. Clara pressed the box to her chest. Her heart ached in a strange new way, a mix of sorrow, comfort, and something close to healing. Can I see where he's buried? She asked. Tommy nodded. Of course. The cemetery was on a hill just outside town. Quiet, surrounded by trees. James Dawson's grave was simple, a granite headstone with his name, birth, and death date. Below it read, a heart that remembered what it could never return to. Clara knelt by the stone. She placed the wallet on top of it. I got your letter, she whispered, and I forgive you. That night, she stayed at Tommy's house. His wife welcomed her with warmth. His children listened to her stories, wide-eyed and curious. It was a beginning, not the one she imagined, but one that felt real and earned. Before bed, Clara opened the last letter in the box. If you ever find your way to me, I'll be waiting. But if I'm gone by then, know that I watched every sunset thinking of you. My brightest light. Love, Dad. Clara looked out the window. The sky was painted in twilight hues. She whispered, "Good night, Dad." And for the first time in 50 years, it felt like he heard her. The morning sun in East Calais was soft, golden, and quiet. Clara stood alone in Tommy's backyard, wrapped in a knitted shawl borrowed from his wife. The crispness in the air kissed her cheeks. Dew glistened on the grass like tiny memories refusing to fade. She stared out toward the forest beyond the property, thinking of her father. Last night's discovery of the letters had left her in a fog of emotions: sadness, relief, guilt, and a strange warmth she hadn't known she needed. She had a brother. She had her father's words. She even had forgiveness. But something still tugged at her. That wallet. Walter Quinn had said he carried it for 50 years. And Walter wasn't a man to overlook something. So why hadn't he noticed the bundle of letters beneath the photo? Clara went back inside and picked up the wallet from the kitchen table. She turned it over again and again, examining every fold, every crease. And then she noticed it, a small tear in the lining. She slipped a fingernail beneath the seam and gently tugged. The stitching came loose. Inside was a thin slit, not visible from outside, just wide enough to hide something small. She reached in. Her fingers brushed paper. She pulled out a folded note. It was old, fragile. The paper yellowed, almost brittle, but the ink had survived. At the top, in shaky handwriting, it read, "To the one who returns this wallet." Clara sat down, hands trembling. She began to read. "To the one who returns this wallet, if you found this and you're reading it, thank you. You may not know the weight you carry in your hands. This wallet belongs to James Dawson, me, or at least the man I used to be. Inside, you'll find a picture of my daughter. Her name is Clara. She was 5 when I left. Not because I didn't love her, but because I loved her too much to let her see me fade. I was sick. Terminal, they said. I believed them. I chose to disappear, thinking I was sparing her pain. But pain came anyway. Years passed, and I lived a second life, trying to build something that could make the first hurt less. It never did. If you return this wallet, if it ever finds its way home, please tell her something from me. Tell her I thought about her every day. Tell her I kept that photo like a compass. Tell her I was wrong to leave. And if she forgives me, tell her she saved me, even from a distance. Sincerely, James Dawson." Clara pressed the letter to her chest. For a moment, she didn't move. Walter had returned more than a wallet. He had delivered the final piece of a shattered truth. This was the letter her father had hidden, not for her, but for the person who might carry his regrets home. She would have to call Walter. Later that afternoon, Clara sat on Tommy's porch with her phone in hand. Walter picked up after 2 rings. "Hello? Mr. Quinn, it's Clara." A beat of silence, then, "Yes, dear. Everything all right? I found something in the wallet. A hidden letter. It was addressed to the one who returns this wallet." Walter didn't speak. Clara continued, voice soft, "I think it was meant for you." She read it aloud. The line went quiet. Clara heard Walter exhale shakily. I didn't know," he said, voice cracking. "I carried it for so long. I kept thinking, maybe one day, maybe this would matter. And it did. Didn't it?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "It did. You were the bridge." Walter chuckled through his tears. "I'm just an old man with a long-haul heart." "You're more than that," she said. "You kept him alive for me." That evening, Tommy joined Clara by the fireplace. He handed her a photo album. "I thought you might want to see these." Inside were dozens of photos, James at birthdays, beside a Christmas tree, building a toy train set, teaching Tommy to fish. He looked older, but always kind, always with a spark in his eyes. Halfway through, Clara found one that made her heart skip. It was James sitting alone in a chair by the window, holding the wallet. It was unmistakable. He was looking down at it like it was the most precious thing in the world. He used to sit like that for hours, Tommy said. He never let anyone touch it. Said it had the only map he ever needed. Clara stared at the photo. The wallet wasn't just a vessel. It was a memory he refused to let go of. And now it had come full circle. Before bed, Clara wrote a letter of her own. Dear Dad, I got your message. All of them. I met Tommy. He's wonderful. You would be proud. I forgive you for everything. And I'll keep the photo close like you did. Love always, Clara. She folded the letter and slipped it inside the wallet, then placed it on her bedside table. Tomorrow she would take it back home, not to bury it, but to keep it where it belonged. The next morning, Clara stood at the edge of the town cemetery in East Calais. She held the wallet in one hand, her own letter folded gently inside it. James Dawson had found peace here. Clara had found answers, but someone else was still living with questions. Walter Quinn. She had heard it in his voice the night before. The guilt, the weariness, the ache that lingered beneath his words. Clara had brought closure to herself, to Tommy, even to her father in a way. But Walter, he was the man who carried the burden. And he deserved something more than a phone call. He deserved to be seen. 3 days later, Clara stood at the edge of a dusty driveway in rural Pennsylvania. The house before her was humble, wrapped in peeling white paint and shaded by 2 old oaks. A small sign on the gate read, Walter Quinn, retired. She knocked softly. The door creaked open and there he was, thinner than she remembered, a little more bent at the shoulders, wearing a sweater too big and socks that didn't match. But his eyes were bright, surprised, unsure. Clara? She smiled. I wanted to come in person to thank you properly. He stepped aside and she entered a small, quiet house filled with old maps, stacked books, and photographs of roads and gas stations long forgotten. They sat at his kitchen table. She placed the wallet between them. Walter stared at it like it was a ghost returned. I read the letter, Clara said gently, the one hidden beneath the cash. Walter nodded slowly. He wrote it for you, not for me. I didn't find it, not in all those years. You weren't supposed to, Clara replied, not until now. He picked up the wallet, running his fingers along the worn leather. You know, I kept this in my glove compartment for 23 years, then in a drawer, then beside my bed. Every time I thought of throwing it out, I heard something inside me say, not yet. He looked up at her. I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. But I remembered his eyes. Clara listened quietly. Walter continued, his voice catching. He sat across from me that night, rain on the window. He looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He paid for both our meals and left without another word, left the wallet too. He clenched his jaw. I should have followed him. I should have asked his name. You couldn't have known, Clara said softly. But I felt it, that something was wrong. I've driven through snowstorms, pulled men from flipped trucks, and never hesitated. But that night I did. His hands trembled, and I've regretted it every day since. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of the photograph, her father holding the wallet by the window. She slid it across the table. Walter stared at it, and he kept it all his life. And the picture of you, always with him. Walter covered his face. Tears fell through fingers weathered by time. He whispered, I didn't save him. Clara leaned forward. No, Walter, you didn't save him that night. But you saved what was left of him. You carried his memory. You brought him home to me. Without you, none of this would have happened. She took his hand. You didn't fail. You finished what he started. They sat in silence, the kind that healed. Later, Walter brought out a cardboard box filled with mementos from his trucking days. He pulled out a worn journal. I started writing about people I met on the road, 1 page each. Your father was page 32. He opened to it. There in blocky handwriting, man in gray coat, sad eyes, left behind something important, said nothing, but his silence said it all. Clara smiled. You always remembered. Walter nodded. I just didn't know what to do with the memory. You gave it back, she said. That's more than most ever do. Before she left, Walter handed her the journal. It's yours now if you ever want to write your version. Clara hugged him tightly. Thank you, Walter, for everything. As she walked back to her car, she turned to see him standing on the porch, the wallet still in his hands. He waved. She waved back. The road stretched before her, but now it was no longer a path of questions. It was a road paved in understanding. That evening, back in New Hampshire, Clara lit a candle by the photograph of her father. She placed Walter's journal beside it. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. Page 1. The man who carried a wallet for 50 years, not because he had to, but because he knew it mattered. Some people are bridges. Others are destinations. Walter Quinn was the bridge, and because of him, I found my way home. She closed the journal and exhaled. Rain returned to New Hampshire that weekend. Not the heavy, pounding kind that battered roofs and flooded streets. No, this was a gentle drizzle, like the sky weeping softly for something it could never quite reach. Clara stood by the window, watching it blur the edges of her garden. The journal Walter had given her rested on the armrest beside her, open to page 1. Her fingers hovered over a fresh page. Page 2! But she couldn't write it yet. Something inside her was still unresolved. Her father had written about her in letters. Walter had carried the burden of his absence. Tommy had filled in the blanks of a second life. But there was still someone missing. Her mother. For years, Clara had avoided digging too deep into the past because she feared what it might cost her mother. Emily Dawson had died 10 years prior, taking her grief to the grave like a locked chest no one could open. She rarely spoke of James after his disappearance. Clara remembered waking up one night at age 6 to find her mother sitting in the dark living room, holding the tiny photo that had once been in the wallet, the same one now back in Clara's hands. Her mother had whispered into the silence, "You look just like him when you smile." It was the only time she ever heard her say his name again. Now, standing in the rain, Clara realized something. Her mother never got closure. She never knew the truth, and Clara couldn't let her memory stay suspended in that unfinished ache. That afternoon, Clara drove to her childhood home. She still owned it. The ivy still curled around the stones. The gate creaked the same way it always had. Inside, everything was coated in dust, preserved like an old photograph. In her mother's room, tucked behind an old jewelry box, Clara found it. A letter, unsent, addressed simply to James. She unfolded it slowly, heart thudding. James, it has been 5 years. 5 years of not knowing if you are dead or simply no longer care. I wake each morning hoping today will be the day the phone rings, that your voice will say it was all a mistake, that you're coming home. Clara still asks about you. I tell her you're traveling. I can't bear to break her heart the way you broke mine. But I'm tired, James. Tired of pretending you vanished like smoke. If you ever read this, if you ever still think of us, know that I would have stood by you no matter the illness, no matter the pain. You robbed us of the chance to choose. Goodbye, James. You were my first love. And my final heartbreak. Emily. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and wept. Her mother had written a goodbye that was never delivered. Her father had written apologies that were never sent. 2 people, 1 love, torn apart not by betrayal or cruelty, but by silence, fear, and fate. Later that evening, Clara visited her mother's grave for the first time in months. She brought two things with her, the letter from James and the letter from Emily. She knelt by the stone, the rain falling gently over her coat. She placed both letters side by side. "You both deserve to read these," she whispered. The wind carried her voice. "You both loved in your own broken way, and I forgive you both." She placed a small daisy on the grave. Her mother had always loved daisies. Then she whispered, "He kept my picture until the day he died." And somehow she felt Emily hurt her. When Clara returned home, she opened Walter's journal again. She began to write. Page 2, the woman who waited in silence. She never got the reunion she deserved. But love doesn't disappear, it waits, even when it's never spoken aloud again. My mother loved a man who vanished. And yet somehow they both stayed. In me, in memory, in this story. She closed the journal, lit a candle, and watched the flame flicker like the final heartbeat of a love story that never got its ending. The town of East Calais, like many places etched in time, wore its history in the creak of its floorboards and the stories passed between neighbors over chipped coffee mugs. Clara returned one last time, not for answers, but for something quieter, closure. It had been weeks since she discovered the truth, since she held letters that bridged 50 years of silence, since she stood between the graves of a mother and a father who never got to say goodbye. Now she had one more goodbye to make. She parked at the cemetery as the sun sank low on the horizon, turning the sky to embers. In her hands was a wooden box crafted by Tommy. Inside, the wallet, the letters from James and Emily, and one final letter from Clara. She made her way to her father's grave. The same soft breeze as before rustled through the trees, like nature itself was holding its breath. Clara knelt. "Hi, Dad," she began, voice quiet. "I know you probably don't need me to say this out loud, but I need to hear myself say it." She placed the box gently atop the gravestone. "You didn't get to say goodbye, neither did Mom, so I guess that leaves it to me." She opened her own letter, hands steady despite the tears already clouding her vision. "Dear Dad, I forgive you. I forgive your absence, your silence, and the pain you left behind. I forgive the birthdays missed, the father-daughter dances I sat out, and the questions that kept me up at night. But more than that, I want to thank you for keeping my photo, for writing me letters you never had the courage to send, for loving me from the distance your fear created. I've met Tommy. He carries your kindness. I see pieces of you in him. Walter said you look like a man with something left unsaid. He was right, but now I think we've said it all. This box, it has everything. The weight you carried, the pain Mom bottled up, and my decision to let it go. You are free now, and so am I. Goodbye, Dad. With love, Clara." She closed the letter, placed it back in the box, and stood in silence. Then gently she stepped back. She didn't bury the box. Instead, she handed it to Tommy, who stood a few feet away with his son beside him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," Clara nodded. "It belongs with your family now. That box has 2 lives in it. It should be passed down." Tommy held it close, emotion tight in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara turned to the little boy, Tommy's son. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," she said, "but he loved deeply. I hope someday you read those letters and understand that love doesn't always arrive in the way we expect." The boy nodded solemnly, as if absorbing something far beyond his years. That night, Clara sat on the porch of the cottage she had rented for her final night in East Calais. The stars stretched wide above, unbroken by city lights. She opened Walter's journal again. Page 3. She wrote, Page 3, the goodbye that took 50 years. Some endings are long, stretched across decades and stitched with unanswered prayers, but they still come. And when they do, they don't arrive like thunder. They come like dusk, soft, inevitable, and oddly beautiful. Tonight, I said goodbye, not because I stopped loving, but because I finally understood that love doesn't need to wait in grief. It can live in peace. She closed the book and placed it beside her. The next morning, Clara packed her bags. Before leaving, she made one final stop, Millie's Diner. The red paint still peeled. The same bell chimed as she entered. Millie turned and smiled. Back again, huh? Clara took a seat at the same booth her father once occupied. I just wanted to thank you, she said, for remembering, for helping. Millie poured coffee into a chipped mug. Honey, I see 100 faces a week. Most I forget. But his? That one stayed with me, like he carried something important he didn't know how to hold. Clara nodded. He did, and you were part of giving it back. Millie sat across from her. Did you find what you came looking for? Clara looked out the window. I didn't find what I was expecting, but I found what I needed. As she left, Millie pressed something into Clara's hand. It was a photo, black and white, faded. A man sitting in the booth, James Dawson, unaware that someone had snapped a candid moment through the diner's glass. I took it that night, Millie said. Something told me it was important. Clara hugged her. You have no idea how much this means. Oh, I think I do. That evening, Clara drove home with the photo beside her. She placed it in a new frame on her mantel, beside the one of Emily. Two people who never got their reunion, but somehow found their way back to the same shelf. She lit 2 candles, watched the flames dance, and whispered, goodbye. Autumn had begun to roll in, subtle and slow, like a memory easing its way back into the room. Clara's home in New Hampshire was awash in amber light. The leaves outside shifted to burnt orange and golden hues, and the breeze whispered through the open windows like a gentle storyteller. She had returned. But nothing felt the same, and in a way that was the point. The framed photo from Millie's Diner sat on her mantel now, beside her mother's. The candles she lit nightly had become ritual, not out of mourning but reverence, the kind you offer to stories that shaped you. Walter's journal lay open on her desk, a blank page waiting. Page 4. But today wasn't about writing. Today was about listening. It began with a voicemail. Clara was making tea when her phone buzzed with a new message. The number wasn't saved. She played it, a man's voice cautious and low. Miss Dawson, I hope I have the right person. My name is David. I was a friend of your father's, James Dawson. We met years ago in Vermont. He mentioned you often. I didn't know he had passed until recently. I have something that might belong to you, if you'd like to meet. Clara stood frozen. The voice knew her name, and somehow she knew his wasn't just a friend. They agreed to meet in Vermont, a small cafe nestled at the base of a hill, quiet, rustic, and filled with the smell of cinnamon and old books. Clara arrived first, her heart unsure whether to feel anxious or curious. Then the door opened. David was in his 70s, wearing a navy jacket and carrying a weathered messenger bag. His eyes were gentle, framed by time, and they locked onto hers with something deeper than recognition. It was remembrance. You look just like him, he said softly. Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. You knew my father? Yes, David said. Very well. They sat at a window table. He placed the bag on the table between them, careful as if handling something sacred. We met in 1974. He had just left everything behind. He was hurting, afraid, but still, James had a kindness that never left him. We became close. He paused. Closer than most people could understand back then. Clara tilted her head slightly, and then she saw it. The way David spoke, the weight in his eyes. The unspoken truth. Her father hadn't just started a second life. He had loved again. You were his partner, she said gently. David didn't flinch. He only nodded. Yes, for nearly 20 years, until we lost touch. I never blamed him for keeping secrets. He always carried guilt. For you, for your mother. He said he didn't deserve peace. Clara reached across the table. But he found some, didn't he, with you? David smiled, eyes glassy. I think he did. He never stopped loving you, Clara. Every year on your birthday, he made a toast to the girl with the daisy crown. I never met you, but I loved you through him. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. There was more to her father than she had ever imagined, and somehow it made sense. He had run not just from illness, but from fear, of being misunderstood, of hurting those he loved. He had built something quietly beautiful. And now David was offering her the final piece. From the bag, David pulled a cassette tape. He recorded this in 1995, said it was for you in case one day someone found you. I didn't listen to it until last week. It's yours. Clara held it like it might crumble. A tape, a voice frozen in time. I have a player at home, she said. Would you come listen with me? David hesitated, then smiled. I would be honored. That night, they sat in Clara's living room, the cassette player set between them. The room was lit only by soft lamps, casting golden halos across the shelves and photographs. Clara pressed play. A crackle, then silence. Then, Clara, if you're hearing this, well, I guess someone did what I couldn't. Her father's voice, older, slower, but unmistakably his. Clara closed her eyes. I'm sorry for the years, for the silence, for not being there to teach you how to ride a bike or tell you that your heart would break, but it would still go on beating. A pause. But I want you to know something. I loved you. With every breath I didn't deserve. I carried your picture because I needed to remember the light I left behind. David wiped his cheek. Clara held her breath. I hope you dance. I hope you fall in love with the sky. And I hope you forgive an old man who never knew how to stay. The tape ended, but the silence it left was full and forgiving. Later that night, Clara opened the journal again. Page 4. She wrote, Page 4, the voice that knew my name. Sometimes we don't get the reunion we dreamed of, but we get the voice. And sometimes that's enough to make peace with the past. I heard him, and he said my name, and somehow that made me whole. She closed the journal. The wind outside brushed against the windows, like someone whispering goodnight. Morning arrived soft and slow, as if the world itself had paused to honor what Clara carried within her. She woke to the smell of earth and autumn, to the silence of peace rather than longing. There was no weight in her chest today, only a warmth that lingered quietly, like the last pages of a good book. The cassette tape rested beside her bed, next to Walter's journal and the framed photograph from Millie's diner. Last night had given her something she never dared dream of. A voice that spoke her name. David had stayed the night in the guest room. When Clara entered the kitchen, he was already at the table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug her mother had once used. He looked up and smiled. Morning, Clara. She smiled back. Morning. They didn't speak of the tape. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with questions, but shared understanding. Clara placed a new envelope on the table. It's for you, she said. David opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, James and David together, arms around each other, standing before the Vermont mountains. I found it in Tommy's box, Clara said. I think you should have it. David's eyes watered. Thank you. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small object, a key. I've decided to leave the house to Tommy, but I'm keeping the cottage in East Calais. I think I'm going to spend part of each year there. David looked surprised. Really? Clara nodded. That place holds more of my father than anywhere else, and maybe more of me than I realized. He raised his mug to second homes. They clinked mugs gently. That afternoon, Clara drove alone to the lake near her childhood home. She carried one thing with her, the final keepsake, the wallet. It had been her father's, then Walter's, than hers. Now it had completed its journey. She sat on the wooden bench by the shore, pulled out Walter's journal, and turned to the last page. Page 10. She began to write. Page 10, the final keepsake. It began as leather, worn and stitched, filled with receipts and photos. But it became a vessel of love, of grief, of memory. My father carried my smile. Walter carried the weight. I carried the question. Now the story has been told, and the wallet has done its job. It brought us together. It brought him home. So I return it, not to the earth, but to the story, where it belongs. Clara closed the journal. She stood, walked to the lake's edge, and crouched down. She opened the wallet one last time. Inside, her photo, aged but still bright. She placed the wallet gently in a sealed wooden box, lined with velvet. Then slowly she released it onto the water. The box floated, catching the light. And then, as if the lake understood, it drifted away. Back at home, Clara placed the journal on a high shelf. Beside it, she added one last frame. A photograph of James, a photograph of Emily, a photograph of Clara. 3 lives, 3 stories, all stitched together by one small wallet, and the courage to find what was never truly lost. That evening, she hosted dinner. Tommy came with his family. David brought flowers. Walter sent a letter. The house was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and quiet joy. No more secrets, no more silence, just voices, all speaking love in their own way. Before bed, Clara stood at the window. The moon hung low. She whispered, "Good night, Dad." And she swore she heard it this time. "Good night, Clara."